neglect. It's contained in the statutory guidance that accompanies the 2014 Care Act and is derived from research. So we're talking about people who significantly neglect their own care. They may also neglect their own environment, particularly living in a context of hoarding. And very often they refuse care and support and healthcare interventions. Research has actually asked people who have experience of self-neglect what has been most helpful for them, and in contrast, what has got in the way of best practice with them. And this particular slide captures in summary form what they have said. And you can conduct your own appreciative inquiry, your own temperature check of where you think your own practice and the practice that you are aware of gets close to, if you like, the standards that they set about what is most likely to be helpful to them. So they talked about engagement, and particularly services not setting barriers to engagement by creating expectations about how service users will engage with them, but actually reflecting on whether in fact it is services who are not engaging with service users rather than the other way around. The importance of concerned curiosity, asking and inquiring into the backstory, how a person comes to be the person that you encounter today. Partnership working, including actually inviting people to multi-agency risk management meetings, complex case panels, case conferences, inviting the person themselves to contribute to those meetings, and basically approaching this in a person-centered way, recognizing the importance of relationship building, establishing trust, maintaining continuity with individuals, and being respectful about the language that we use. For example, in a context where we might consider that a person is hoarding, recognizing that actually the contents of what we might regard as hoarding have enormous emotional significance for the individuals themselves. Roughly 45% of all safeguarding adult reviews focus on self-neglect. It is the most frequently reviewed type of abuse or neglect. And common features of the findings of safeguarding adult reviews in Walsall and indeed elsewhere is contained on this slide. A failure to explore and understand what self-neglect might mean for the individual themselves. We're back again to the lack of concerned curiosity. Assessments which are partial, not thorough, omitted completely sometimes. Assessments which rely on what an individual says rather than also exploring whether they have executive functioning, whether they actually have the capacity to act. Making assumptions about lifestyle choice, and not using the provisions in law, particularly Section 42 of the Care Act, the duty to inquire. These are common shortcomings found routinely in safeguarding adult reviews. How many of those perhaps do you recognise from your own practice or from the practice that you are aware of? But we can turn those shortcomings actually into an evidence base for best practice. And that evidence base for best practice has 4 particular domains or layers. And again, I would invite you to do a temperature check or an appreciative inquiry. How close in your own practice and how close in practice that you are aware of do services get to the different components of the evidence base? So here you can see 9 components that should characterize our work directly with individuals who self-neglect. Is that work person-centered, relationship-based, establishing trust, even where that takes time? Are we understanding the person's history, the backstory, through concerned curiosity? How thorough are the assessments that we do, for example, of risk or of mental capacity? Do we fully understand the impact of trauma and adverse experiences that actually might help to explain the backstory of self-neglect? And when people are approaching significant transitions, whether those individuals are care-experienced young people or people approaching discharge from hospital, for example, are we attempting to provide wraparound health, housing and social care? And finally, are we thinking family? Is there a circle of support available to this individual if only we were to inquire about it, from family members, from neighbours, from friends, from social contacts? We have an evidence base about direct practice. How close do we get? And many of the SARs tell human stories that identify why these components of direct practice are so important. So on this slide relating to Eric, the finding was about curiosity. Those involved in this particular case missed opportunities with Eric, and particularly with his wife and his daughter, to try to understand the backstory, the different transitions that Eric had gone through that might help to explain his particular self-neglect. There were shortcomings too in not exploring the different legal options that might have been available, including, in this case, the Court of Protection. And practitioners involved did not take the time to ensure that those providing care, particularly his wife and his daughter, understood the support that they could receive as carers from the local authority and from other services. And perhaps we overlooked the fact that Eric, yes, had a right to private and family life, but he also had a right to life. And we needed to balance those different human rights in determining how to intervene in his particular case. The human story of Duncan, very different, a younger person with significant forms of mental distress, where actually we needed to ensure that safeguarding was personal. Duncan was very clear what he wanted at the end of a long stay in a psychiatric unit and then being discharged into a homeless hostel for homeless people. He was very clear what safeguarding would look like for him, but that didn't feature in how services responded. And there were findings here about the inadequacy of risk assessments in his particular case, which underscore the importance of thorough risk assessments in situations of self-neglect. And we have to ask ourselves, I think, why concerned curiosity is so difficult. People who self-neglect have given clues about what matters to them if they are to open up to our concerned curiosity. We have to establish relationships that service users will recognise as careful in the hyphenated sense of that word. In other words, full of care. We have to explore what might not be so obvious, but equally we have to pay attention to what is obvious. For example, in relation to people who live in conditions of hoarding but who also smoke, there are clearly questions to be asked about how they will keep themselves safe from the risk of fire death in such a situation. There may be occasions when you have experienced enormous anxiety or difficulty in asking questions that, in a sense, reflect concerned curiosity. I have certainly been there myself and found it very difficult to ask particular questions at a particular point in time. So I've put here some hypotheses, if you like, some reasons why sometimes we might all experience concerned curiosity to be difficult. If that is the case, who supports you? Who looks after you? Who can you rely on to help you prepare for what you anticipate to be difficult conversations? And who can you talk about the outcome of those conversations once you have had them? Here is the second domain, 9 components in this domain of what I might call the team around the person. We need a bespoke team around the person, bespoke in the sense that we bring in practitioners and services that have a contribution to make to the diverse needs that an individual presents: health, housing, social care, environmental health, fire and rescue, and so on. We need services to work together rather than to bounce referrals one to another. We need information sharing, recognizing that for an adult at risk, the law does not prohibit the sharing of information in order to safeguard them. We need a much more extensive use of multi-agency meetings, whatever you call them in Walsall and elsewhere. And within a context of a multi-agency approach, we need everyone to be clear what their individual roles and responsibilities are, and in particular cases, to nominate a lead agency and a key worker to coordinate the collaboration between different services. And then lastly, in Walsall as elsewhere, there will be adult safeguarding boards, partnership arrangements of senior leaders whose responsibility it is to make sure that adult safeguarding is effective, not just in relation to self-neglect, but also in relation to other types of abuse or neglect. How often, I wonder, do you access the website of your local safeguarding adult board and partnership? How often do you look at the safeguarding adult reviews that they have completed and the policies and the procedures that they are promoting? And then lastly, we have to recognise that your work takes place in very difficult and complex and challenging circumstances. A decade or more of financial austerity, increasing demand and increasing complexity, not least because of the ongoing COVID pandemic, and sometimes social policies and legal rules that pull against each other. And so it is important that through your representatives on safeguarding adult boards, you call out national government when you think that national government is not doing as much as it could do to provide you with a facilitative context in which you can be the best practitioners and managers possible. This is a slide that gives you further references if you want to explore more fully what we know about self-neglect. And thank you for listening, and particularly thank you for the work that you do.